Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something a bit darker, the age of plagues, punishments, and snacks. Yep, snacks. We're going deep into what life was really like in the Middle Ages. Forget castles and knights, like Hollywood wants you to believe. The truth. You probably wouldn't survive a day, so before you get too comfy, take a sec to like and subscribe only if you actually dig what I'm doing here, and drop in the comments which channel you're watching and what time it is where you are. Always fun to see who's joining us from all around the globe. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise. Let's take a little nighttime trip together. Congrats, you just woke up in the year 1325. Good news, you're still alive. Bad news, fleas. Your bed's a rotting straw mattress stuffed with bugs and hay that smells like a barn floor. Because, surprise, it is the barn floor from 3 months ago. No fancy memory foam, no pillows, and definitely no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket from last winter that's now as heavy as a calf thanks to all the dirt. You blink awake as the church bells ring from far away. This is the medieval version of an alarm clock, louder and way less merciful. Your home. A wooden hut with one room, no windows, and an open layout where family, livestock, and insects all share the same space. The scent. Oh, it's a fragrant symphony, a subtle mix of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you desperately hope isn't mold, though your soul doubts it. Scented candles, not invented yet. And even if they were, they'd melt all over your dirt floor. You try to stretch, but instantly regret it because the air is freezing and your joints ache. You're 22 years old, which back then meant you were basically middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a sack of rocks getting shaken by a confused farmer. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor might be wet from last night's rain, seeping through the thatched roof, or crusty thanks to your neighbor's chicken leftovers. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the local ecosystem. Oh, and privacy? What's that? Your whole family and maybe some cousin who never leaves is waking up right next to you. No bedrooms, no curtains, no alone time, just communal everything. Welcome to a morning in medieval Europe, where you're never really alone thanks to parasites, rodents, and 8 other people sharing your space. And that's how your day starts. Spoiler, it only gets worse, so you've escaped your horrifying medieval haybed. Congrats. Now nature's calling, and it's not asking politely, it's screaming. Here comes the part where you start missing modern bathrooms. No toilets, no seats, no toilet paper, no flush buttons, not even an awkward plunger in the corner. In the 14th century, going to the bathroom was an adventure, a social experiment, and often a little public event. If you were a peasant, your bathroom might be a wooden bucket behind the house, filled with water because Uncle Wolf Stan had a rough night after eating bad turnips. The smell biblical. You hold your breath, do your business, and here's the kicker. You toss it out onto the street. Yep, the street. You'd shout something like Gardaloo before tossing it out the window. That's old French for watch out below, although, let's be honest, nobody could move fast enough anyway. Medieval town streets were open sewers, charming rivers of human waste, animal poop, and mysterious liquids you don't want to investigate. If you were lucky enough to live in a town with a public toilet, congrats. You gotta sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outdoor latrine, where privacy was a myth and ventilation was a cruel joke. You could make small talk, just don't breathe too deeply. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most folks wiped with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or if they were feeling fancy, a scrap of wool. Sometimes, nothing at all. This might explain why handshakes weren't really a thing yet. And if you happened to live in a castle, well, that was supposed to be better, right? Yeah, kinda. You got a protective cloak and a hole in the wall that dropped your business straight into the moat. Brilliant idea, except your enemies knew about it too. And, yep, sometimes attackers climbed right up through the moat. Talk about sneaking in the back door. So, whether you were a peasant or a lord, medieval bathroom breaks were basically a humiliating ritual, cold, public, dangerous, and always disgusting. One slip on those wet stone paths, and you'd face plant into humanity's leftovers, and you hadn't even brushed your teeth yet. But we'll get to that later. You survived the latrine. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a nice breakfast, something warm, tasty, and comforting. Too bad. Welcome to medieval Europe. No comfort here. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a sad little meal. No eggs, Benedict. No coffee machines buzzing you awake. Definitely no buttery toast. You'd squat or sit by the fire with a wooden bowl holding something that looked like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily soup. Sir pottage was a thick, gloopy stew made from whatever you could scrounge grains, veggies, maybe some beans if you were lucky. It simmered in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, with new ingredients dumped on top of old ones. It was more of an ongoing edible science experiment than a recipe. Alongside it, a piece of bread so hard it could deflect an arrow, made from rye or coarse barley flour, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other creative ingredients, because wheat was a rich person's dream. That bread was not your friend. You didn't slice it, you negotiated with it. And drinks forget orange juice or oat milk lattes. You drank beer? Yep, beer. At 6 a.m. Why? Because water was basically a parasite soup with dirt. So you started your day with a light, low alcohol, high survival brew. Kids drank it too. No one was thrilled about this. But hey, at least it didn't kill you instantly. Want meat or cheese? Dream on. That was a Sunday and holy day luxury. And only if your lord was feeling generous. Most peasants got meat a few times a year, fresh fruit, only in season and before it turned into wine. And don't even think about spices, unless you were royalty. A pinch of pepper cost more than your monthly paycheck. Salt was so precious, it had to be stashed away. So you gnawed on that rock-hard bread, took a swig of medieval beer, and tried not to think about the rat that might have nibbled your porridge. Overnight, breakfast didn't fuel you. You just kept going. And now, starving. It was time to work like your life depended on it. Because it did. So, you've finished your dismal medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it helped much. Your entire wardrobe was one outfit. A coarse wool or linen tunic you'd worn daily for months, maybe years. No seasonal fashion here. You wore it until it fell apart or got infested with mold. You might have had underwear, if lucky. A linen shirt under the tunic. If not, you went shirtless under scratchy, damp wool and painstakingly stitched by someone who probably didn't know how sewing was supposed to look. No washing machines, no soap, zero dry cleaners. So your clothes were yellowed, stiff, and smelled like a compost heap brewing in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, good luck. You had to fetch water from the river or boil some, scrub your tunic on an ash-covered board, or just lie it out to dry in the sun, which took about 3 days a year. And don't get me started on shoes. If you had a pair, they were made from rawhide, crudely stitched, supporting your arches like banana peels. Most peasants just went barefoot through mud. Dung. You know what hand sewing looks like. Besides that, no washing machines, no soap, and absolutely zero dry cleaners anywhere. So your clothes end up yellowed, stiff, and smelling like a compost heap that's been marinating in a pigsty. Even if you want to wash them, good luck. You have to fetch water from the river or boil some over a fire. Then scrub your clothes on an ash-covered board or just lay them out to dry in the sun, which takes about 3 days a year. And don't get me started on shoes. If you actually owned a pair, they'd be made from untreated leather, crudely stitched together, and support your arches about as well as a banana peel. Most peasants just went barefoot through mud, manure, medieval minefields, aka sharp rocks and nasty puddles, all of which means one thing: your skin hates you. You're constantly itchy. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs live rent-free on your body. Everyone has them, nobles, sketchy monks, itchy kids, basically a moving insect farm. No escape. Back in the Middle Ages, or as I like to call it, the era of sharp rocks and disease-filled puddles. All this means one thing: your skin absolutely hates you. You're itchy all the time. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs are basically living rent-free on your body. Everyone has them, nobles, lousy monks, itchy kids. Basically a mobile insect farm. No one escapes. You're scraping your armpits with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and nobody even blinks. Your skin's all scratched up from the rubbing. Your scalp, a battleground of bites. And if you get a rash, oh boy, it gets worse. No dermatologists, no hydrocortisone, no one telling you it might be scabies. You just keep suffering, and if you're lucky enough not to get an infection, well, congrats. That rash will stick with you for the next 6 months like an unwanted medieval roommate. Now, dressed in misery and feeling miserable, it's time to go outside and work yourself to death. Now, bundled up in damp wool clothes, it's morning smile time, except you don't smile. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling was a dangerous game, not emotionally, but for your teeth. No toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. Dental hygiene was as rare as bathing, which is to say, almost non-existent. Some folks might chew on twigs or rinse with wine or vinegar, but mostly your teeth were a natural disaster waiting to happen. By your mid-20s, your smile looks like it came straight out of a haunted crypt. Cavities everywhere, gums swollen, and that's not just food stuck in your teeth, that's decay. Your mouth smells worse than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, though not everywhere yet, was becoming a luxury import, mostly for fancy pastries or flaunting wealth. If you were noble, congrats. Your teeth rotted faster than a peasant's. If you were poor, you got to enjoy this slow torture thanks to sourdough bread, thin porridge, and years of heavy chewing. Toothaches. Get used to them. They're, like medieval weather, always there. The pain makes you pray, drink water, or yank your own tooth with pliers. And that's no joke. That was the actual treatment. There were no dentists, but there were barber surgeons. Yep. The same guy who cut your hair also pulled your teeth by candlelight, with iron hooks and zero anesthesia. Infected teeth. Hope you like fevers, because without antibiotics, it easily turned into sepsis and you died from a toothache. Yep. What gets us to the pharmacy today could have been your funeral back in the 1300s, and there was no social safety net either. Kissing good luck with that. Hallucinations and bad breath everywhere. If you were single, people didn't judge you by your smile. They sized you up by your land and livestock. Bottom line, your mouth was a war zone, and it was losing. Now your teeth are stabbing in pain. So get outside, because the real work, the work that actually wears you down, is just starting. Time to get to work. Except no office, no desk, no coffee breaks, and no promotions. Your job, if you're like 90% of people, is simple: don't die while working so others can be comfortable. You're a farmer. Congrats. That means you're toiling on land, owned by a lord who probably doesn't even remember your name. You wake with the sun and quit only when it dips. Behind the trees, your tools, a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones are still intact in your body. No weekends, no quitting time, just sunrise to sunset. 6 days a week, Sundays a day off. But only if you're not harvesting, fending off intruders, or praying desperately your infected toe doesn't turn black. This job's brutal. You plow by hand or with an ox. If you're rich enough to afford one, you dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine bends like an S. Nobody cares if you're tired. Nobody checks on your mental health. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just do the field work. You belong to a lord who probably can't even remember your name. You wake up with the sun and stop only when it slips behind the trees. Your gear: a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones you can salvage from your own body. No weekends off, no quitting time, just sunrise to sunset. 6 days a week. Sundays are off, but only if you're not harvesting, fighting off invaders, or praying your infected toe doesn't turn black. This job's brutal. People plow by hand or with oxen if you're lucky enough to own one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine curves into a perfect S shape. Nobody cares if you're tired. No one checks on your mental health. And if you're a woman, surprise, you don't just do the field work. You also have to raise the kids, clean, cook, spin yarn, feed the animals, and pretend your husband's lice aren't your problem. You're exhausted. No one's checking on your mental health, by the way. And if you're a woman, surprise, you don't just do the farm work. You also have to take care of kids, clean, cook, spin thread, feed the animals, and pretend your husband's lice aren't your problem. No, slowly shuffle over to your bed. Kids start helping out around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and dreams of not dying from the flu someday. And if you're one of the few who isn't a peasant, maybe a blacksmith, tanner, or cooper, cool, you still spend all day dealing with fire, chemicals, or animal guts in poorly ventilated workshops. Your paycheck basically covers survival. Perks include occasional bleeding, broken bones, real charmers, fever drink, some warm beer, and keep going. You can't take a day off, not even one, because if you stop, well, don't work, you don't eat, and if you don't eat, medieval Europe had a backup plan. They called it replacement labor. So you clutch your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. In the Middle Ages, your job wasn't a career, it was a slow motion endurance test. Now that your back is screaming from field work, let's talk weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature had less to do with seasons and more with relentless punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. No insulation, no central heating, and zero weather protection. Just wooden walls with gaps big enough to toss a chicken through. Your windows covered with fabric, not glass. The fire in the hearth sounds nice in theory, but you don't have enough wood to keep it going because wood was pricey, and sometimes stealing wood from the forest was illegal. Yep, you could be executed for grabbing the wrong stick from someone else's forest. You wrap yourself in a damp wool sweater, shiver near the dying embers, and still wake up with a frozen nose. Your feet are perpetually cold and wet, your fingers stiff as medieval popsicles. No fancy frostbite diagnosis. They just called it bad luck. Now, fast forward to summer. Sounds better? Right, nope? In summer, your house turns into a clay oven. No fans, no breeze, and zero deodorant. You sweat through layers of clothes, but you can't take them off because showing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, bug bites, and social judgment. Flies swarm. You, drawn to your unwashed body and the lingering smell of last week's goat stew fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz in your ear as you try to sleep, assuming you can sleep with neighbors yelling and kids crying. On the fields, the sun scorches you. No sunscreen, no hat, unless you fashion a straw hat that looks like a sad scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke wasn't just bad, it was a fact of life. So, you're either shivering inside, wondering if your toes might just pop off, or sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe like crazy. And one thing never changes. No matter the season, your clothes itch, your food sucks, and the next chore is waiting. Welcome to medieval climate control. Nothing. Feeling thirsty? Need a splash of water to snap out of this damp fever. Too bad. Back then, water wasn't your friend. It was quietly trying to kill you. Let's start with drinking. That nearby stream looks fresh, bubbly, and clear, straight out of a fantasy movie. But spoiler alert, it's not. Upstream, someone just dumped a chamber pot into it. Or maybe there's a rotting pig carcass somewhere. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire medieval European germ army are waiting in every sip. That's why people drank beer. Yep, beer even the kids. But before you picture medieval children slinging pints, know this, it was a weak, low alcohol brew, but it packed a punch. Brewing boiled the water, making it safer than anything flowing through the town gutters. Wine was another option if you were rich enough to buy it and didn't mind being useless before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for that. In theory, yes. In practice, nope. You see, back then, people believed bathing actually opened, and if not that, then probably a rotting pig carcass in there, parasites, bacteria, and the entire medieval European microbial army are just waiting in every sip of water. That's why everyone drank beer. Yep, beer even kids. But before you picture medieval children selling draft beer on the street, know it was a low alcohol, barely their buzz kind of brew. Brewing boiled the water, so it was safer than anything flowing through the town's gutters. Wine was another option. If you were rich enough and didn't mind being useless before noon. What about bathing? Sure, water was used for cleaning in theory. In reality, not so much. See, back then people believed bathing actually opened your pores and let diseases in. Yep, bathing was considered a health risk. Apparently, you stayed cleaner by never washing off your protective layer of dirt. You should clean yourself. Theoretically, in reality, not so much. See, back then people thought bathing actually opened your pores and let disease crawl right in. Yep, bathing was considered a medical risk. Apparently, you'd be cleaner if you never washed off that protective layer of grime. Public baths did exist, but they quickly turned into gossip hubs, scandal hotspots, and sometimes venues for some seriously medieval extracurriculars. So, naturally, the church stepped in and shut many down. Even if you wanted a bath, it was a full-on production. You'd have to fetch water from a well, boil it over a fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, then pray no one else in the house uses it before you, or worse, after you. And rainwater was collected in open barrels where you had to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, then pray no one else in the house used it before or worse, after you, and the rainwater collected in open barrels where birds dropped their business, bugs multiplied, and moss threw a party. Sounds refreshing, right? So whether the water hit your mouth, your body, or the crops, it was less life-giving and more like a gamble with death. Just one sip wrong, and you spent your last days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your belly, reflecting on every bad life choice. Next time you take a sip of tap water, raise your glass to our ancestors. They didn't get the luxury of clean water without danger, so you gotta drink up. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine was basically polite torture with a theology degree. Let's start with diagnosis. Any weird symptom, cough, rash, broken bone, plague, was blamed on your mood imbalance. The 4 bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medieval science said your health depended on keeping them balanced, like some gross internal soup. Got a fever? Too much blood? The cure, bloodletting? Yep. Suck the life out of you into a bowl with a dull blade or a hungry leech. And yes, barbers usually did it. Imagine getting a haircut and a blood transfusion at the same time. Buy one, get one free. Darling, feeling sad or anxious? Obviously too much black bile. The cure, laxatives. Could be a warm herbal cleanse or just pray and ice pack while everyone avoids eye contact and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you broke a bone or got seriously hurt, you were really in trouble. No anesthesia unless you count fainting from pain. Surgery was done with unsterilized knives from the Crusades. Tools heated over a fire not to sterilize, but to look more intimidating. Antibiotics centuries away. Germ theory. Not even a twinkle in anyone's eye. They thought sickness came from bad air or God being ticked off at your moral failings. Stomachache. Must be your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy vomiting. If you got worse, you got more leeches. Maybe some crushed beetles. and a priest at your bedside ready to perform last rites if needed. By then, they were prepping what they called a cure death, and if by some miracle you pulled through, everyone assumed God took pity on you. The doctor got all the credit. The leech got promoted. Yep, medieval medicine wasn't about healing, but about keeping you alive after the treatment. After a long day dealing with lice and leeches, it was finally time to eat. You'd drag yourself home, stomach growling, ready for life's last joy, a warm meal. Bad news, the meal might try to kill you. Let's start with basics. No food preservation, no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or hoping winter air kept things fresh. Your meat, if you were lucky, hung out for days, covered in flies, salted in mystery brine, and maybe shared with a couple of rats. Take your hemoglobin all at once. Buy two, get one free. Darling, feeling sad or anxious? Obviously, that's too much black bile. The cure, laxatives. Could be a warm herbal cleanse, or just praying and applying cold compresses while everyone avoids eye contact and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you broke a bone or got seriously injured, you were in real trouble. No anesthesia, unless you count fainting from pain. Surgery was done with unclean knives, dating back to the Crusades. Instruments were heated over fire not to sterilize, but because it made them look scarier. Antibiotics, that's centuries away. Germ theory, not even on the radar. They figured sickness came from bad air or an angry god. Got a stomachache? Must be your sinful thoughts messing you up. Hope you're thrilled about the vomiting that's coming. If you get worse, say hello to more leeches, maybe some crushed beetles, and a priest ready to drop last rites just in case. Yep, they called this treatment preparing you for the grand finale death. But if by some miracle you survive God's mercy, obviously, the doctor gets all the credit, and the leeches get promoted. That's medieval medicine for you not curing, just stalling death. After a long day fighting lice and leeches, finally time to eat. You drag yourself home, stomach growling, ready for life's one joy, a hot meal. Bad news, that meal might be trying to kill you. Let's start with the basics. No food preservation, no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or winter air hoping to keep things fresh. Your meat, if you were lucky enough to have some, probably hung around for days covered in flies, soaked in mystery brine, and shared with a few rats. Bread was the medieval diet's foundation, but even that wasn't safe. In bad harvest years, desperate peasants stretched food with bark, sawdust, or even clay, and if it was rye season bonus time, ergot fungus, which could cause seizures, hallucinations, and sometimes death. Imagine eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables only showed up in season, and guess what was always in season? Turnips. So many turnips was the staple of the medieval diet. But even that wasn't safe. In bad harvest years, desperate peasants would stretch food using bark, sawdust, or even clay. And if it was rye season, you got a bonus ergot, a fungus that causes spasms, hallucinations, and sometimes death. Basically eating LSD-laced bread and getting tetanus. Veggies were only eaten in season, and you know what was always in season? Turnips. Too many turnips. Boiled, smashed, or stewed. So if you remember chapter 3, that's basically a hot swamp bubbling with mysterious ingredients, simmering since your great-grandpa's funeral. In autumn, fruit might be available, but they'd mysterious ingredients, simmering since your great-grandpa's funeral. In autumn, Fruit might show up, but it rots fast. Sugar rare, pricey, and hoarded by the rich just to show off their black teeth. Milk's another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese are better quality, but full of bacteria. People still eat them because, honestly, it's either that or chewing on your boot leather. And spices. Oh boy, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg worth more than gold for the average farmer. Flavor comes from onions, salt if you're lucky, and some heat. Most meals taste like soggy burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's a political headache. Game animals belong to God, not you. Poach a rabbit, and you're facing fines, jail, or even execution. Yes, your dinner could get you hanged. So when you sit down to that gray stew by the flickering fire, remember every bite is a risk, yet you eat anyway because in the Middle Ages, food didn't nourish you, it challenged you. Now it's evening. You've worked, suffered, and barely digested your suspicious stew. You might think the day's over, but don't get comfy because God's watching. Same goes for the priest and your neighbor Agnes, who'll rat you out if you miss Mass in medieval Europe. Religion wasn't just part of life, it was life. The church controlled schedules, laws, your education, whether you could read, births, marriages, deaths, everything. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always late on rent. Every day revolved around the church bells. Town church bells rang morning, noon, and night. Not because people needed reminders, but skipping prayers was a sin. Forget to bow sin. Eat meat on Friday sin. Dream about the neighbor's wife double sin. And yes, hell was very real, vivid, terrifying. Priests painted detailed pictures, rivers of fire, boiling blood lakes, demons with pitchforks, eternal screams. If plague didn't scare you, eternal damnation sure would. You couldn't read the Bible yourself, it was in Latin, a language only monks, clergy, and some noble brat spoke. You relied on the church to explain everything, which meant if the priest said crop failures were your fault for not praying enough, better get on your knees more. Tithes, a tenth of everything you own, were mandatory. Grow wheat, give wheat. Raise chickens, give eggs. Got nothing, congrats. You're spiritually bankrupt and about to be financially ruined. Holidays were holy days, dozens of them. Sure, they gave you a break from work, but fun, nope. So you showed up to Mass, fasted, confessed, and reminded yourself that joy was a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church was a death wish. Heretics got burned alive, witches drowned, blasphemers whipped, skeptics re-educated fast. So you stuck to the routine, you chanted, you bowed, you prayed your dusty soul would make heaven if the priest liked you, because in the Middle Ages, God might have mercy. The church, not so much. Be just as lively with the priest and your neighbor Agnes, who'll definitely rat you out if you skip Mass. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't just part of life, it was life. The church ran your schedule, your rules, whether you could read, your birth, marriage, death, everything. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always late on rent. Every day revolved around the church bells ringing. Town church bells chimed morning, noon, and night. Not because folks needed reminders, but skipping prayers was a sin. Miss a beau sin. Eat meat on Friday sin. Dream about the neighbor's wife double sin. And yep, hell was very real. Priests described it in glorious detail: rivers of fire, boiling lakes of blood, pitchfork-wielding demons, eternal wailing, If plague didn't scare you, eternal damnation sure would. You couldn't even read the Bible yourself, it was in Latin, a language reserved for monks, priests, and some noble brat. You relied on the church to translate. So if the priest said your bad harvest was because you didn't pray enough, guess what time to pray harder? Buddy, tithes a tenth of everything you owned were mandatory. Grown wheat, give wheat, raised chickens, give eggs, had nothing, congrats. You're spiritually bankrupt and about to be financially too. Holy days, plenty of those. Sure, they gave a break from work, but don't think for a second it was for fun. So attend Mass, fast, confess, and remind yourself joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church dangerous, heretics got burned, witches drowned, blasphemers whipped, skeptics re-educated fast. Eggs, if you had nothing. Congrats. You were mentally bankrupt and financially close to it too. Holidays were holy days, dozens of them. Sure, they gave you some time off work, but not for fun. So you'd attend Mass, fast, confess, and remind yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church was risky business. Heretics were burned alive, witches drowned, blasphemers flogged, and skeptics quickly re-educated. So you stuck to the routine. You chanted, you bowed, you prayed your soul. After enduring this dusty life, might finally make it to heaven, assuming the priest liked you, because in the Middle Ages, God might be merciful. The church, not so much. If you think being a medieval peasant was rough, try being a woman. All the filth, famine, and fear, plus childbirth, submission, and invisibility in society in the Middle Ages. Being a woman was like hardcore mode without a health potion or restart button from birth. A girl's path was set. Being a woman was like being stuck on hard mode with no health potions and no reset button. From birth, a girl's life path was set in stone. Marry young, pop out kids, serve the husband, and die exhausted. Education, almost non-existent, unless you came from nobility and got sent off to a convent, where your brain's growth stopped as soon as you mastered churning butter and patching tunics. Marriage happened early, like really early. Engagement at 12 and pregnant by 14. Totally normal. Love, nah. This was all about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion not required. Once married, you pretty much became your husband's property. Your job, make heirs, feed everyone, keep the household running, and don't even think about complaining. Complaining might get you labeled a nag or worse, a witch, and that label usually means drowning or burning at the stake. Depending on local customs, having a baby A deadly lottery, no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives did their best, but even minor complications could kill mom, baby, or both. Some women survived 10 pregnancies. Many did not, but don't worry. Once the baby's out, your workload spikes. Now you have a screaming infant in a lice-infested hut, plus cooking, cleaning, and farm work. No rest for the weary. You're the family's backbone. Not married, you're suspicious. Widow, you're vulnerable. Speak your mind. You're dangerous. Women who didn't toe the line were often called witches, especially if they knew herbs, had a strong personality, or just gave someone a weird look on a rainy Tuesday. Even in church, your role was tiny. Nuns lived by strict rules, no talking without permission. no free movement, and your spiritual value barely recognized, always ranked below men. In short, as a medieval woman, you were expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and keep quiet, ideally with a smile, because even in the age of universal misery, women were supposed to suffer gracefully. So far, you've battled filth, famine, social injustice, and maybe even a goat. Just when you think your day can't get worse, violence shows up, loud, bloody, and perfectly normal by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were anything but peaceful. Law and order mostly meant hoping your local lord wasn't in a bad mood. Violence was everywhere home. Streets, battlefields, church disputes, and sometimes even at the public bakery line. Crime was common, punishments brutal, and justice more like a spectacle than protection. Steal a loaf of bread. You might lose a hand. Accused of lying, they could pierce your tongue. Gossip too much. Meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask with an iron bit in your mouth, designed to fix you. Got charged with something serious heresy. Theft. Witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? Easy torture. Welcome to the ultimate challenge. One version had you dunk your hand in boiling water to grab a stone. If the burn healed clean in 3 days, you were innocent. If not, guilty as charged. Another option thrown into a river. Sink your innocent, but probably dead. Float guilty and still punished. Think of it as a medieval game show where survival is the prize and the host is actively trying to kill you. And if you were sentenced to death, it was a public event. Executions happened in front of cheering crowds, hanging, beheading, burning alive. Sometimes folks even brought snacks. It was medieval cable TV. Domestic violence totally normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and kids. Street fights, daily life. You could get beaten just for accidentally looking at a noble's horse the wrong way. And war, always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, holy wars. Someone was always stabbing someone else in the name of honor, God, or sheer boredom. And order mostly meant hoping your local lord wasn't in a bad mood. Violence was everywhere, at home, on the streets, on battlefields, church disputes, and sometimes just waiting in line for bread at the public bakery. Crime was rampant. Punishment was brutal. And justice felt more like a circus act than actual fairness. Steal a loaf of bread, say goodbye to a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much, meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped on with an iron bit in your mouth. All for correction, of course. Got accused of something serious, like heresy, theft, or witchcraft. How do you prove innocence easy by getting tortured? Welcome to the ultimate medieval challenge. One version. Dip your hand in boiling water and fish out a stone. If the burn heals clean in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, guilty as charged. Another option, get thrown in the river, sink and you're innocent, but probably dead. Float and you're guilty and still punished. Basically a medieval game show where the prize is survival, and the host is actively out to get you. And if you're sentenced to death, it's a public spectacle. Executions were crowd pleasers, hanging, beheading, burning at the stake. Sometimes people even brought snacks. The Middle Ages version of cable TV. Domestic violence totally normal. Husbands were allowed and even expected to discipline their wives and kids. Street fights, everyday stuff. You could get beaten just for accidentally looking the wrong way at a noble's horse, and war always simmering, local feuds, territorial disputes, holy wars. Someone was always charging in to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or just boredom. Violence wasn't the breakdown of medieval society, it was medieval society. Everyone lived with the constant knowledge that life was fragile, justice was random, and your neighbor might bash your skull in over a pig. So, tread carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone holding a golf club. By now, you've survived lice, leeches, no laundry, and the looming threat of public disgrace. But now comes the final chapter: territorial disputes, religious holy wars. There was always someone stabbing someone else in the name of honor, God, or just plain boredom. Violence wasn't some glitch in medieval society. Nope, it was the society. Everyone lived with the constant vibe that life was fragile, justice was a wild card, and your neighbor might just bash your skull in over a pig. So, tread carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone wielding a golf club. By now, you've survived lice, leeches, the misery of not having laundry, and the looming threat of public disgrace. But now it's time for the final chapter of most medieval lives: an early, not so glamorous death. If you're still breathing past your 40s, congratulations. You're basically a celebrity. You might even get called an old man, which is less a compliment and more like, let's break it down. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, but that's mostly thanks to baby death rates dragging it down. Nearly half of all kids didn't make it to age 5. Disease, starvation, or a brutal winter was all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, congrats. You basically entered adulthood running on empty. Work started as soon as you could stand, and by 25 your joints creaked like a monastery door. You probably lost a tooth, a finger, and most of your initial optimism. Women faced a special death trap: childbirth, one of the top killers for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical help, just prayers, hot water, and someone holding your hand as you bled out on a straw mattress. Men had their own brand of deadly problems: farm accidents, infections from tiny cuts, a drunk neighbor's rage, a failed crusade. Even walking to the market could be risky if you ran into a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also sneak in quietly: plague, turning towns into graveyards overnight, or famine lasting entire seasons, emptying villages, or bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your last hours hallucinating and screaming at walls, and funerals lucky if you even got one. Bodies were buried fast to dodge disease. No embalming, no fancy coffins, just a hole, a couple of whispered prayers, and a shallow dirt mound if there was still space in the churchyard. Yep, medieval life was brutal, short, and death was always lurking in every shape and form. No retirement. You just stopped showing up. And speaking of escape, let's move to the final chapter: the medieval dream is dead. So how's your day going? Woke up filthy, peed in a bucket, brushed your teeth with hopeful thoughts, nearly fainted from hunger, worked until your spine begged for mercy, scratched all over, prayed you wouldn't catch the plague, and almost got publicly executed for keeping a squirrel. Welcome to a day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of being a knight? Think again. The romantic version of the Middle Ages: brave swordsmen, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles, Candlelit feasts is just fairy tales and sci-fi fan fiction. The real medieval world was harsh, cruel, and ridiculously unfair. The hierarchy was everything. Born poor, congrats. You're stuck there. Born rich, well, good news. You had a better shot at survival. But even then, you were just a sneeze away from disagreement and a rushed burial from bad soup. Nobles weren't off the hook either. Castles were flea-infested stone fridges, full of smoke and politically arranged marriages. Sure, you had fur cloaks and a fancy cup of wine, but there was also a 50% chance you'd die from a skirmish or an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. And simple times were anything but simple. No rest. Everything took forever. Everything hurt more, from childbirth to chewing. Everything had consequences. Life was survival, not entertainment. And if you found a quiet moment to think, dream, imagine something better, well, good luck doing much with that. No promotions, no modern medicine, no internet to Google. What's this weird rash? You lived, suffered, worked, and died within 10 miles of where you were born. But here's the kicker. Fairy tales and sci-fi, the medieval world was harsh, brutal, and wildly unfair. Hierarchy was everything. Born poor, you stayed poor for life. Born rich, congrats. You had a better shot at survival, but even then, you weren't safe from descent or a hasty burial in some awful soup. Nobles suffered too. Castles were chilly stone fridges full of fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you had fur cloaks and wine goblets, but there was a 50-50 chance you'd die from a skirmish or an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. Simpler times weren't simple at all. They never stopped. Everything took longer. A pesky infected splinter. Luxury, forget it. Simpler times weren't simple at all. They never stopped. Everything took forever. Every damn thing hurt, from childbirth to chewing. There were consequences. Life was survival, not entertainment. And if you managed to snag a quiet moment to think, dream, or imagine something better, well, good luck doing much with it. No promotions, no modern medicine, no internet to Google that weird rash. You lived, endured, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of your birthplace. But here's the craziest part throughout all that. Suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the crazy part. During all that, people still laughed, sang, told stories, loved, and found meaning in life. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, they carved out space for light. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, silently thank the modern world and your ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you don't have to. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, Reform Queen, and ambition icon. She was just Sophie Federica Augusta von Anhalt Zerbst, born in 1729, daughter of a rather obscure German royal family. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania didn't pack much power, but Sophie had something no title could buy: razor-sharp smarts, relentless charm, and a burning hunger for greatness. She was raised super strictly. Her mom, Johanna, was cold, calculating, not exactly the warm, nurturing type, but more the social climbing, status-obsessed variety. Sophie's dad, a Prussian officer, was more distant than strict, from early on. Sophie learned how to juggle obedience with cunning. She read tons, spoke several languages, and mastered the art of sizing up a room before opening her mouth. These skills soon became survival tools at one of Europe's most brutal courts. When Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna started hunting for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter himself was German-born, and Elizabeth figured a foreign bride, obedient and grateful, would be easier to control. Sophie ticked all those boxes: noble blood, Lutheran faith she'd have to ditch, and a rep for being both graceful and humble. At just 14, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in chilly St. Petersburg in 1744, wrapped in thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mom pushed her forward like a chess pawn, but Sophie had her own game in mind: to be accepted by Russian society. She converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-changing. She didn't just switch religions. She stepped into a foreign empire with no way back. No one looking at that quiet teen in her fur cloak could guess what was next: betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, empire. But the moment Sophie stepped into the Russian palace, she stopped playing the innocent and started planning to become queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was supposed to secure her spot in the Russian royal family, but right from the start, it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to Russia's throne, was no dashing fairy tale prince. Awkward, immature, obsessed with toy soldiers. He cared more about playing war games in his room than running an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some records even suggest he refused marital relations for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and hated the Russian court that adopted him. Meanwhile, Catherine embraced Russia with fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted out. This mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a hotbed of gossip, paranoia, and ruthless power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute power, but her health was failing. Everyone knew the switch was coming, and everyone had their own agenda. Catherine was constantly watched. Her letters were read, friendships spied on, every move monitored. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who whispered into her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her own servants. In this world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight, but Catherine wasn't stupid. She learned to play court politics quietly, building allies in the shadows. Gossip, paranoia, and brutal power plays. Queen Elizabeth still ruled with absolute power, but her health was failing. Everyone knew the transition was coming, and everyone had their own agenda. Catherine was constantly under surveillance. Her letters were read. Her friendships watched. Every move she made was monitored. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who still whispered in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight. But Catherine wasn't a fool. She learned to play the court game quietly, building allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, befriended scholars, and gained a reputation for dignity and restraint. A total contrast to her husband's childish antics and disdain for Russian tradition. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reading the works of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, while others saw her as a young wife. She was crafting a vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a strong, educated nation. Reasonable, but here's the kicker: the longer Peter lived, the more Catherine was stuck as the powerless wife of a man totally unfit to rule. So she waited, watched, and schemed. She knew the Russian throne wasn't something you inherited. You had to take it. In 1762, after nearly 20 years of waiting, watching, and quietly pulling strings, Catherine spotted her moment and grabbed it with jaw-dropping precision. Queen Elizabeth had died, and Peter the Third, had finally become Tsar, but his reign started falling apart immediately in just a few short months. Peter alienated the church, insulted the nobility, humiliated the army, and showered praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed major policies, disgraced the clergy, and openly talked about divorcing Catherine to Mary, his mistress. The court, already wary of his weird antics, turned cold. The army, packed with generals loyal to Catherine, grumbled in the halls. Even everyday Russians, devout patriots, saw Peter as a foreign puppet, mocking their traditions. Watching all this unfold, Catherine made her move in July that year, while Peter was at his summer palace. She pulled off a bloodless coup with the backing of key military officers, including her lover Grigory Orlov and his influential brothers. She rode through St. Petersburg decked out in full regalia, declared herself Empress Catherine II, and won the loyalty of the powerful royal guard. Peter was caught off guard and friendless, surrendering within days. He was arrested and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was a fatal intestinal disease caused by hemorrhoids. Unofficially, murder. Catherine was now an empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by sheer will, brains, and guts. This was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had seized the Russian throne without a single battle, but her real challenge was just beginning. She had to turn this bold power grab into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she keep the empire from ending up like her husband? Catherine knew power won by scheming could just as easily be lost. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. So she began her transformation from a cautious plotter into a reforming queen, the kind who would redraw borders, embrace Enlightenment ideas, and redefine what it meant for a woman to hold power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her laurels, but she didn't. She had bigger plans than just sitting on a throne. She wanted to change Russia, and not just militarily or politically, but intellectually too. While Peter worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even as she ruled with absolute power herself. Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she lived it. She exchanged letters directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her dictatorship. She invited Diderot to her palace and even bought his entire library to support him financially, behind closed doors. She tirelessly drafted legal documents, debated reforms, and built policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was packed with efforts to codify Russian law. She set up a legislative commission in 1767, an ambitious project to rewrite Russia's entire legal code. The Nakaz, or Catherine's instruction, was basically drafting legal texts, debating reforms, and building policies to modernize the empire. The early years of her reign were packed with efforts to codify Russian laws. She set up a legislative commission in 1767, an ambitious project to rewrite Russia's entire legal code. The Nakaz, or Catherine's instruction, was basically a political manifesto in disguise, talking about equality before the law, dangers of torture, and the ruler's duty to serve the common good for an 18th century Russian queen. This was radical stuff, but Enlightenment ideals had to survive in Russia's reality, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land ruled by nobles who liked their social order just fine. Thank you very much. Catherine knew this. Though she backed reforms, she acted very cautious. She ditched some torture methods, widened access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also doubled down on letting the nobles control their waves to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act, a philosopher queen on stage, a pragmatic queen behind the curtains. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between Parisian fancy salons and Moscow's cutthroat politics. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated in many ways. Catherine wasn't trying to turn Russia into Europe. She wanted to modernize Russia her way, and that meant reform, yes, but with an iron fist inside a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reform just at home. She wanted to expand it outward, turning Russia into a fearsome empire, admired and envied by all, where Peter the Great opened windows to the west. Catherine aimed to tear down walls. Under her rule, Russia's borders were pushed wider than ever. She waged wars not just to protect her throne, but to redraw Europe's map. One of her most important campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves through the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about land grabs. They were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule and the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia snatched key territories, including Crimea, the northern Black Sea coast, and much coveted warm water ports that Russians had dreamed of for generations. These victories weren't just military wins. They sent a message. With every conquest, Catherine declared, Russia is no longer Europe's backward, far-off cousin. It's a continental powerhouse. She also turned her gaze westward through a series of deals and diplomacy. Catherine took part in the partitions of Poland, slicing up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth alongside Austria and Prussia. By the Third Partition in 1795, Poland vanished from the map, and Russia claimed huge new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't conquer just with armies. She also spread ideas. New cities popped up, trade routes expanded, German settlers were invited to farm Russian lands. The empire became a patchwork from the icy Baltic Sea to the sunny shores of the Black Sea, and through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing her growing empire's shape. Critics called her power-hungry, even imperialistic, But for Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. She believed a great ruler was judged not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia, she wanted to remake the empire into a civilized empire that scared enemies, earned respect from peers, and answered only to her with all her smarts and power. Catherine the Great was also famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, it wasn't all whispered in libraries. Her private life became one of the most talked about parts of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully hand-picked crew, decades younger, usually handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they played nice. If not, they got quietly fired, sometimes with a polite thank you. Handsome, and sometimes politically influential, she didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among her most important lovers was a Grigory Potemkin, a man as smart as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between love, politics, and partnership. Some historians even think they might have secretly married together. They shaped military campaigns, colonial projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, he was co-ruler with her in many ways. Yet Europe still. Just ignore the scandal. Rumors spread like wildfire. Satirical books painted her as some insatiable nympho and even a bit crazy. And after she died, the gossip only got nastier. The most infamous tale, totally bogus and bizarre, involving a horse, spread by her enemies to trash her legacy. Why so obsessed? Simple. Catherine was a woman who held power without batting an eye. And in a world where women rulers were supposed to be either holy virgins or tragic figures, she said, "Nah, I'll do it my way." She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, which made her downright dangerous. Ironically, while critics called her immoral, Catherine actually had a deep philosophy about love and sex. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life and personal relationships, didn't have to mess with public duty. She separated feelings from ruling a feat even most male rulers couldn't pull off. In fact, her relationships were often strategic. She surrounded herself with loyal, capable, politically useful men, and when they outlived their usefulness, she let them go with a smile and a generous retirement package. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her power. It was part of her game plan. That mix of passion and power made her unforgettable, enviable, and a bit scary. With all her charm and clout, Catherine's reign wasn't without danger, and in 1773, danger came in the form of a bearded Cossack warrior named Yelony Pugachev. He wasn't your average rebel. Pugachev claimed he was none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. According to him, he survived a coup and was back to snatch the throne from the German usurper. Talk about a tall tale. Peter had been dead for ages, but to Russia's oppressed, desperate lower classes, it didn't have to be true. It just had to give them hope. Pugachev promised to free them, stop the plundering, cut taxes, and hand out land to the common folk. His words lit a fire across the rustic riverlands, especially among peasants and former Cossack followers. At a time when the gap between nobles and commoners was growing. His promises sounded like salvation. Pugachev's rebellion became the biggest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns fell, forts crumbled, nobles got slaughtered for a terrifying moment. It looked like the empire itself might collapse. Catherine was shocked. This wasn't some foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a rebellion by her own people against the regime she ruled. But Catherine didn't freak out. She acted. She sent professional troops to brutally crush the revolt. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, caged in iron, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a very public warning to anyone thinking of following him. Afterward, Catherine tightened control and kept order. Her dream of liberating the masses quietly drowned in silence. The uprising showed her the limits of enlightenment in a country still shackled by feudal chains. Now she leaned more on loyal nobles, trading them absolute control over their serfs. It was a turning point. The queen who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reforms got cautious. Oversight increased. Rumor even had it the rebellion was snuffed out before it could catch its breath. Pugachev might have lost his head, but he left Catherine with a haunting warning. Power built on inequality only lasts so long. Before the storm hits, as Catherine the Great entered her twilight years, quoting Voltaire now preferred stability over philosophy. Reforms got cautious. Surveillance increased. Rumors even claimed rebellions would be crushed before they could catch a breath. Pugachev might have lost his head, but he left a haunting warning for Catherine. Power built on inequality can only last so long. Before the storm hits, as Catherine the Great entered her final years, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, longer than any queen in Russian history. Since taking power, she defied every expectation, reshaped her empire, and redefined what it meant to be a woman and a ruler. Under Catherine's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by more than 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, parts of Poland, and Black Sea coastlines. These weren't just military victories, but strategic moves that secured warm water ports and reshaped trade routes. But her legacy wasn't just on the map. Catherine also stamped culture all over Russia. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, amassing one of Europe's greatest art collections, and exchanged letters with the brightest Enlightenment minds. Her court became the hotspot for sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition in a country usually seen as a backward mess by Western Europeans. Catherine put Russia on the cultural map. She modernized education, started girls' schools, and pushed book printing. She introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even personally getting vaccinated in public talk about bold science for her time. But her reign was full of contradictions. Admirer of Enlightenment ideals, sure, but she never escaped political turmoil. In fact, she expanded her grip deeper into Russian lands. Her reforms, while impressive, were mostly top-down mandates designed to polish the empire's image without actually shaking up its foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She got that power isn't inherited like grandma's china. It's crafted, managed, and fiercely guarded. She ruled not by divine right, but by sheer willpower, political savvy, and non-stop calculation. People called her many things: manipulator, tyrant, reformer, seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was richer, bigger, and stronger than it had been for centuries. She left behind a solid throne, an expanded empire, and a legend that lasted for ages. Catherine didn't just rule, she ruled with brains, strategy, and a deep understanding of history, and in doing so, she became more than a queen. She became a legend with all her power, expansion, and lasting legacy. Catherine the Great was still a woman running a man's world and reshaping it in her own image. Behind those royal portraits and state decrees was someone painfully aware of her shaky position. She wasn't born Russian. She seized the throne. Through a coup, she ruled an empire that didn't want a woman in charge. Yet, she didn't just survive, she thrived. Catherine never settled for being just decoration. She read nonstop, wrote endlessly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was packed. Hours spent reading reports, dealing with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court full of factions that hated each other. She wasn't content to just sit on the throne. She ran it like a born politician. In many ways, she was lonely too, surrounded by courtiers, lovers, and artists. Yet she wrote in her memoirs that very few people she could really trust. Her son, Paul, whom she didn't trust and kept away from state affairs, grew up to be the man she feared might wreck everything she built. Her greatest love affair was with Grigory Potemkin, which deepened into a close friendship. But his death in 1791 left a wound that never fully healed. Catherine carefully crafted her image. She knew the power of a good story and used it better than most kings of her time. She portrayed herself as the mother of Russia, an enlightened monarch, a warrior, a queen, and an art lover. But behind those roles was a woman who endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, yet kept pushing forward. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire changed, but full of questions. Could she have done more to end corruption? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she foreign forces, editing state documents, and managing a court full of rival factions? She wasn't content with just sitting on the throne. She ruled like a female politician born to rule. In many ways, she felt lonely. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, but wrote in her memoir that there were very few people she could truly trust. Her son, Paul, whom she didn't trust and kept away from state affairs, grew up to be a man she feared would destroy all her achievements. Her greatest love affair with Grigory Potemkin turned into a deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never really healed. Catherine carefully crafted her image. She understood the power of a good story and used it better than most monarchs of her time. She called herself the Mother of Russia, an enlightened ruler, a warrior, an empress, and an art lover. But behind all those roles was a woman who endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, yet kept moving forward. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed but full of questions. Could she have done more to end corruption? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she a reformer or a ruler? History remembers her by a title she never gave herself, the Great, not because she was perfect, kind, or fair, but because she held power and used it. her own way at a time and place where women weren't supposed to have that power. She didn't just wear the crown, she rewrote the meaning of deserving it. In the damp jungles of Chiapas in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque whisper stories from the ancient Maya world. Towering temples rise above the canopy, their limestone faces, weathered by time but still packed with secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets spilled out. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, were poking around Temple 3, a modest pyramid next to the more famous temple with the carved inscriptions, the burial site of the great King Paco the Great. No one thought that temple hid much until they spotted something odd, a sealed chamber below. No tomb raider had ever touched this place. It was untouched. When the archaeologists broke through the shell and lowered themselves inside, they found a stone coffin lying silently. The air was thick with the weight of centuries. When they lifted the lid, red dust puffed up like smoke, a blinding, brilliant red. Inside was coated with cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used in rituals. And inside that deep red cloud lay the skeleton of a woman. She'd been buried carefully and with respect. Her bones, though fragile, were intact, her skull still, wearing a jade mask, and her body surrounded by offerings necklaces, a crown, earrings, all crafted from jade and shells. Everything about this burial screamed royalty, but no name was ever etched. No hieroglyphs to ID her. This is one of the richest female tombs ever found in Central America, yet she remains a mystery. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she, queen, priestess, or maybe Pacal's wife? Researchers call her the Red Queen, and that name stuck to this day. But even with modern forensic science, they can't be sure who she really was, only that she lived in the 7th century, during Palenque's golden age. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers was hidden, untouched, and deliberately set apart. Her burial wasn't just a ceremony, it was spiritual. This woman wasn't meant to be remembered with words. They wanted to honor her through ritual, color, and the mystery she left behind. The creepiest part of the Red Queen's tomb isn't the jade jewelry or the eerie silence of the sealed chamber. It's the red dust, a layer of thick cinnabar powder covering everything: the coffin, the walls, her bones, even the offerings around her. It stuck like blood smeared on stone. For the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from ground mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its bright red color wasn't just eye-catching. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force linking the human and divine realms. Red was sacred, the color of dawn, sacrifice, and life springing from death. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual. Covering the dead with cinnabar was a ritual meant to transform the body, preserving it not to last forever, but to transition, according to Maya belief. Death wasn't the end, it was a passage, a crossing into another layer of the cosmos. So the Red Queen, whoever she really was, wasn't just being buried, she was being deified. But there's a darker twist. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can cause mercury poisoning, shaking, hallucinations, and even death. The Maya probably didn't get the chemistry, but they felt its power. It was unstable, potent, and dangerous. Bathing the dead in that powder was a way of declaring this person was no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, only a few were buried with Cinnabar, Pakal. The mighty king who ruled this place's pyramids was one of them. His body, like hers, was soaked in that red dust. That detail alone sparked plenty of speculation, unrest, strength, and danger. Bathing a corpse in that powder was a statement this was no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, very few were buried with Cinnabar, Pal. The great king who ruled this site was one of them. His body, like hers, was soaked in that red powder. That little detail alone sparked plenty of speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, mother, or some sort of divine equal? Her skull rested on a jaguar skin. Another sacred symbol. Around her were bone pins, obsidian blade swords, and tiny jade statues hinting at rituals performed during her life or in her honor after death. Every part of her burial told a silent story. Gus, story of power hidden in secrecy. A woman about to enter the underworld, not in silence but in. Surrounding the bloodied bones of the Red Queen was a silent world, broken only by the sparkle of jade, shells, and obsidian stones. This wasn't just decoration, these were offerings, each carefully chosen to accompany her on the Maya journey to the afterlife, Xibalba. Next to her were heavy, cold jade necklaces, polished to a shine even after 300 years underground. Jade isn't just pretty, it's sacred. The Maya saw it as a symbol of eternal life. It stood for the green of the maize, the jungle's vitality, and the breath of the gods. Only the elite got buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign. She wielded influence in life, maybe even had a direct hookup with the divine. One of the creepiest items was a jade mask gently laid over her face. Unlike Egypt's flashy gold death masks, this one was subtle, made from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles arranged in the shape of a goddess's skull. The mask had a ritual purpose to protect her soul, preserve her identity, and show she was divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone pins, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. They could be ritual tools or symbols of her status as a priestess, healer, or royal queen. One bone pin was carved, faded but purposeful, a tiny echo of her voice lost to time. At her feet and along the tomb's edge were sealed ceramic jars, probably once full of offerings, food, drink, or incense to keep her spirit going after death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a dangerous, layered, challenge-filled journey. These items weren't luxuries, they were necessities. To modern eyes, the tomb feels intimate, not over the top, but deliberate. No golds, no chariots, no showy stuff, just spiritually valuable chosen treasures. It's a map of the soul. Through these treasures, we see the Maya understood death not as an end, but a transfer of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was gearing up for ascension alongside the tomb's grandeur. The Red Queen left, a haunting void. No name, no inscriptions on her coffin, no hieroglyphs on the walls to identify her. She was clearly powerful, but who was she? Since her tomb was opened, scholars have tried to piece together the story. The strongest theory says the Red Queen is Zekbu-Ar, wife of Kinich, Janab Pal, now known as Pal the Great. Palenque's most famous ruler, Zakbu-Ar, wasn't just Pal's wife. She was born into nobility and married young into Palenque's royal dynasty. She gave birth to at least 3 sons, all high status, and played a key ritual role during her husband's reign. If anyone deserved such a grand burial, it was her. Supporting this theory is the tomb's location, just feet from Pal's grand burial site at the Temple of Inscriptions. Their proximity suggests a deliberate pairing husband and wife, rulers even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 tombs in Palenque were found with such thick cinnabar coating, yours truly, and the Red Queen. Probably not a coincidence, but here's where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were done on both skeletons, hoping to confirm their relationship. The results? Not convincing yet. Her bones don't show a direct blood link to Pal, but that doesn't rule out a marital bond. After all, marriage doesn't always mean shared DNA. Some think she might be Sakuk, Pal's powerful mother who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others say she could be a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name got lost to history's erosion. However, the clearest evidence actually points to Teku Ao, a queen by title, mother of kings, and Pal's spiritual equal. The fact she's unnamed might not be an oversight. Maybe it was totally on purpose. In the Maya worldview, souls don't live on through monuments, but through rituals, symbols, and the earth's whispers. So the Red Queen hovers somewhere between legend and reality, a woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in deep red and silence. To get the Red Queen, we gotta understand her world, a world where Maya women, especially royal women, had way more clout than most folks assume. In Maya civilization, politics was basically family business. Royal women weren't just passive tagalongs. They brokered power, they ran rituals, funded temples, and played a major role in keeping their dynasty's legitimacy intact. Their bloodline was political capital used to forge alliances and secure claims to the throne. Take Sak Kuk, Pal the Great's mom, when Palenque's throne went empty. She grabbed the reins herself and ruled as queen regent until her son grew up. She wasn't a placeholder. She ruled in her own right, issuing edicts and overseeing building projects. Without her, Pal might never have risen, and she wasn't an anomaly. All over the Maya world in places like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul inscriptions show women running important rituals, engaging in diplomacy, war, and sometimes ruling outright. They're often pictured in murals, decked out in fancy hats and costumes, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes even above them. Their words were carved in hieroglyphs, their names remembered until nobody remembered anymore. When the Spanish conquered these lands centuries later, much of that memory was eroded. Colonial viewpoints saw indigenous women as silent figures in a male-dominated world. But archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles where power was negotiated, not just inherited. This context flips the Red Queen's story. She might not have ruled officially, but her lavish, sacred burial next to Pal shows she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration. It symbolized identity and power, held in life and guarded in death. Her bloodline might have been the glue holding the Palenque dynasty together in Maya civilization. A queen was more than just a queen. She was the keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in rituals, and often the bridge between gods and humans. The Red Queen might be nameless, but in her world, she never went voiceless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasure, she was laid to rest in an architecturally meaningful structure, full of cosmic layers, ritual symbolism, and Maya intentional design. Her tomb wasn't just a grave, it was a gateway to eternity. Her body was found inside Temple 3, one of the smaller pyramids in central Palenque. But her spot near the temple, with Pal the Great's inscriptions, is especially notable. These temples weren't built randomly. Their locations were sacred, guided by astrology, mythology, and dynastic legacy. Her temple looks modest next to its giant neighbor, but it hides something even more private. A sealed tomb untouched by anyone, perfectly preserved. It's built deep inside the temple's core, accessible only by a narrow, steep staircase. Going down to her tomb is almost symbolic, a ritual journey into the underworld. The chamber itself is simple, made of cut stone, sealed tight for over 130 years. No statues or murals cover the walls. No ornate carvings tell her story. But maybe that silence is. No statues or murals adorn the walls. No carvings tell her story. But maybe that silence was intentional. This isn't a place for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. In the center, her sarcophagus looks like an altar carved from limestone. It calls to mind Pal's famous stone tomb next door, while Pal's lid is famous for cosmic rebirth imagery. The Red Queen's tomb is more subdued. The focus is inward, on the body, the ritual, and all that morbid ceremony stuff. Still, there's some fancy architectural hints dropping deeper meanings. The tomb runs east to west, symbolizing the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber's small, but packs a punch. It feels intentional, private like a sacred cocoon for someone important. Maya Temple's cosmic tools, bridges between heaven, earth, and the underworld. Being buried here, you're basically upgraded from mortal status. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a carefully crafted temple where death equals transformation. Her bones locked in stone, her essence sealed in cinnabar, her legacy etched in the architecture itself. A silent temple that screams. She mattered. For ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld called Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this journey was more than spiritual. It was political, cosmic, and deeply ritualistic. Funeral rites were carefully staged events, straight out of mythology, guiding souls through the underworld's dangers. Maya texts and symbols tell us Xibalba wasn't a chill afterlife hangout, more like a dark maze. Blood rivers, trials, and death gods. Only the properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually armed made it through. The Red Queen was wrapped in mourning cloth, sealed in stone, surrounded by offerings. Classic upper-class send-off. But wait, there's more. Bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hint at self-sacrifice rituals, maybe tools symbolizing power she wielded alive or reenacted at burial to empower her spirit. Her herary mask, carefully pieced from jade, wasn't just bling, it might have been a spirit container, protecting her face and identity crossing to the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face mirrors the soul, which needs the god's nod of approval. The pottery around her could have held chocolate, corn beer, water, or even pulque, basically snacks for the other side. Other items like stingray spines or conch shell trumpets, spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or ritual communication props. Burial wasn't just goodbye, it was transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were earthly gods incarnate. When they died, they returned to their divine roots. The Red Queen, decked out in blood red, buried in a pyramid and honored with offerings, was gearing up to be reborn, not as a mortal, but as a cosmic entity tied to the universe's sacred order. Her burial wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of her legend. Just a few steps from her final resting place is one of Central America's most iconic tombs, Kinich Jana Pal, aka Pal the Great's. His burial inside the Temple of the Inscriptions is praised for its artistry, scale, and deep spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb extraordinary isn't just what's inside, it's where it was found. Her coffin was hidden in Temple 3, right next to Pal's monument, in a city like Palenque, where every temple is carefully aligned with cosmic principles. This proximity, not a coincidence. It's a bold statement carved in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen is Zakbu Ao, Pal's queen and trusted partner, and her legend, just steps away from the Red Queen's final resting place, is one of Central America's most iconic tombs, Kinich Jana Pal, known as King Pal the Great. His burial inside the temple, carved with grand inscriptions, is praised for its artistry, scale, and deep spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb extraordinary isn't just what's inside, but where it was found. Her coffin was hidden in Temple 3, right next to Pal's monument, in a city like Palenque, where every temple is carefully placed to reflect cosmic principles. That proximity isn't a coincidence, it's a deliberate statement. A statement carved in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Zakbu Ao, queen and trusted consort of Pal, though her tomb lacks inscriptions. The similarities between the two tombs are striking. Both are wrapped in cinnabar, both buried in pyramids, both buried with jade, and both treated with extreme reverence. These rituals mirror each other like two halves of a sacred story. Pal's lid famously shows him falling into the world tree, a cosmic scene about death and rebirth. The simpler tomb of the Red Queen lacks such symbols, but the symbolism is in their pairing. If Pal represents the sun, traveling through the underworld by night, only to rise again, then the Red Queen might symbolize the moon, feminine power charting her own mysterious path across the sky. Together, they show the universe's two sides, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual in Maya mythology. Rulership isn't a solo gig, it's about relationships. Cosmic harmony demands balance, and that balance spills over into the court by placing the Red Queen beside Pal. The Maya weren't just sealing a marriage, they were forging a cosmic partnership. Their closeness in death probably mirrors their roles in life. A queen who stands not behind, but beside her king, sharing not just the throne, but the legacy. In their tomb, they speak without words, two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone, connected across eternity, one of history's most sacred silences. Though her name has been lost to time, Palenque's Red Queen isn't a forgotten relic, but one of the ancient world's most mysterious and powerful women. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, raising deeper, louder questions with every discovery. She embodies a mystery still not fully understood. We might never know exactly who she was. No hieroglyphs bear her name. No thief told her story. Yet, the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her blood-stained skeleton all speak volumes about a woman of profound importance, not just a wife or consort, but a real power player with spiritual heft and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to rethink assumptions. She's a reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were no wallflowers. They performed rituals, ruled cities, and shaped dynasties, while kings like Pal hogged the spotlight. The Red Queen's comeback tells us power isn't just a man's game. It flows through mothers, queens, priestesses, and prophets. Her legacy isn't just the treasure she left behind. It's the conversation she sparked among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in the temple tells us something intentional. This woman mattered, and maybe that's the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts, it's a living puzzle, a shared human craving to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies in red garb, the color of life and sacrifice, blood singing and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now looks back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains unnamed but not voiceless, a mystery but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death, she rules something greater our imagination, her tomb sealed in stone, her story written in silence. Yet somehow, she still speaks. Frida Kahlo was born July 6th of 1907 in the bustling Coyoacan district, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, Casa Azul, the Blue House, bursts with color, contradiction, and quiet power. Later, it became a shrine, a battleground, and a museum dedicated to one of the 20th century's most iconic artists. Frida was the third of four daughters to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, a devout Catholic with indigenous and Spanish roots. Her parents were quite the contrast. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual, Matilda, devout and emotionally distant. Frida inherited her dad's introverted nature and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a kid, Frida was bursting with imagination, blunt and downright bold. She read tons and asked questions most adults would rather dodge. But by age 6, polio hit her hard, leaving her right leg scrawnier and weaker than the left. She tried hiding the difference with long skirts, but never let it kill her spirit. The illness kept her bedridden for months, isolated from other kids. During that time, she grew closer to her dad, who pushed her to exercise, bike, and keep her mind sharp. Unlike most girls her age, Frida didn't dream of being a wife or homemaker, with her sights set on becoming a doctor. She enrolled at the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at just 15. She was one of the very few girls admitted. There, she stood out not just for brains, but for her rebellious wit, progressive thinking, and unique style. She joined a young intellectual crew called Las Cachuchas, who argued about philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution and ideas that shook up tradition, but even in those early years, before the bus accident that reshaped her body and before fame shaped her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself sharp-edged, bold, and with an identity too big to fit anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán, she was gearing up to reinvent herself completely. On September 17th, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life got cleaved in two, the girl she was and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she hopped on a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomes Arias, after school. They laughed, teased each other, maybe even argued a bit. Frida never did anything halfway, but just minutes later, the bus collided with a streetcar and her future shattered in a mess of pain, metal, and silence. The crash was brutal. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, smashing wood and hurling passengers. Frida was pierced by an iron handrail. It went into her left hip and came out through her pelvis. Her spine was broken in 3 places. Her right leg was fractured, dislocated, collarbone and ribs shattered. Her shoulder was out of joint. Her abdomen was pierced, and she was only 18. One man covered her with a borrowed jacket. Another noticed her body sparkling not from blood, but from gold powder she'd been carrying. The powder exploded on impact, dusting her broken body with what looked like glittering ash. Frida was rushed to the Red Cross hospital and went through multiple surgeries in the following months. She was plastered up for weeks, lying flat, motionless, writhing in infection and anxiety. The future she dreamed of as a doctor drifted farther away, but in that stillness, something started to stir. Her dad gave her a paintbrush. Her mom set up a special easel above her bed. A mirror was hung on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, plastered and in pain, Frida began to paint. At first, out of boredom, then obsession. Her first subject was her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity, it was survival. The accident wounded her body, but opened a door into her mind, her body, and eventually the surreal language of pain and identity that shaped her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now started healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay in plaster and steel, her body fighting every breath, as she began to paint. What started as therapy quickly became a language so raw, brutally honest, and hard to look at exactly on purpose. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain, her own pain, physical, emotional, existential pain. Her first subject was self-portraits, not from arrogance, but because, as she said, I paint myself because I am often alone, and I am the subject I know best. A self-portrait not because she was full of herself, but because, as she said, I paint myself because I am often alone, and because I am the subject I know best. Her early works were small-scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, those religious paintings telling tales of suffering and miracles. Frida flipped that tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions turned into an altar. She painted herself as torn apart, pierced, bleeding, in one painting. She's basically a walking, bleeding metaphor, nailed like some modern-day martyr. In another, she's floating over a barren land, tied to a broken pole, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself crying, in agony, beheaded and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain didn't heal. She turned the ugliness of trauma into beauty, defiance, and even a bit of dark humor. Each piece was a replay of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that constantly tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual storytelling, a mashup of Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became autopsies, dreams of her soul framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she was well enough to walk, though still in pain, Frida was no longer the girl who wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was nothing anyone had ever seen before. She turned the worst thing that ever happened to her into a wellspring of creativity. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain, she made the whole world take notice, and in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and only 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would have the most intense and stormy relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years older and already the most famous Mexican painter, towering and imposing. Rivera was a giant of Mexican mural art, famous for massive, political murals telling the story of Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his opinion on her work. She marched up to the Ministry of Education, interrupted his unfinished business, and bluntly asked, "Am I talented?" Diego glanced over her paintings and said, "Yes," and not just out of kindness. He saw something rare in her, a raw, honest voice, humble, angry, sarcastic, painful, and beautiful. They started a relationship that was both time-consuming and creative. Frida once said, "I've had 2 accidents in my life. One was getting hit by a streetcar. The other was Diego. They married in 1929. A weird combo for outsiders. Diego, huge, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, hobbling around on crutches. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their relationship was fiery but chaotic. Diego supported her art and pushed her painting career, but he was also constantly unfaithful, even with Christina. Frida's sister, Frida was heartbroken, and in response, she had lovers too, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and artist Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later with new terms. This time, Frida kept control of her independence, home, money, and name. Their second marriage wasn't just about love, it was also about creative partnership and mutual understanding, despite betrayal and pain. Diego remained an indispensable force in Frida's life. He challenged her, hurt her, but also believed in her as an artist, a revolutionary, and a woman who could redefine what painting meant. They were never peaceful together, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York, while he completed famous commissioned murals. Those years abroad forced her to confront industrialism, American wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, which made her deeply politically uneasy. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a devoted communist, and an admirer of indigenous. Politically uneasy, Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a devoted communist, and a big fan of indigenous traditions, the luxury she saw in the U, especially during the Great Depression that wrecked most of the country, only made her disillusionment worse. In letters home, she mocked the materialism and obsession with appearances in that culture. She missed Mexico's grit, color, and contradictions. While Diego painted huge murals on factory walls, Frida started making smaller, quieter revolutionary paintings, deeply personal stuff, on tin and canvas tarps. Her style was solid, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. During this time, she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity, she painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape, with a body constantly hurting from accidents, numerous surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit. She turned inward. Her portraits show her bleeding, fragmented, and exposed, but her face is always calm, always straightforward, never apologetic. One of her strongest works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying in a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss of fetus, a snail, medical tools, a cracked pelvis. It's raw, vivid, and full of feeling, a painting drenched in truth back in Mexico. Frida dived into left-wing politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he was in exile. Frida wore a Tijuana skirt, traditional indigenous gear, not just for style but as a political and cultural statement. Her art never separated from her beliefs. Her identity, body, and ideology were woven right into her work. While Rivera painted murals about the revolution, Frida painted the human cost, broken bodies, burning minds, and a self, always looking back in exile and illness. She wasn't just an artist of pain, but an artist of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become a whole new force, an artist whose work shone with raw honesty, surreal symbols, and cultural identity. Back home, she fully lived as herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacan became a sanctuary of color and contrast, bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots roaming free. The house was a vivid extension of Frida's imagination. It was a mix of tradition and rebellion, elegance and rustic charm. Here, she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, pinned flowers in her hair, and painted amid the smell of copal incense and mariachi bands playing on the street outside. This phase marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more complex, symbolic, and political. Works like The Two Fridas revealed a split self. One wore European clothes with a tender heart. The other, dressed in indigenous garb, strong and serene. It was Frida's pictorial autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and legacy. In 1939, she exhibited in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her powerful, unique style. But even among surrealists, Frida stood out. When André Breton tried to slap, dressed in native clothes, strong and calm. That's Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and legacy. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her bold, unique style. But even among surrealists, Frida stood out when André Breton tried to slap a surrealist label on her. She pushed back. "They think I'm a surrealist." She said, "But I'm not. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the postcard perfect version, but the vibrant country she loved. Her work is bursting with symbol skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and broken columns not just seen, but felt. Anyone who's ever suffered and turned that pain into something sacred knows exactly what I mean. She lived in the suburbs and made them her stage. She embraced blood. She honored her indigenous roots while exposing the brutal violence of past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew louder, her health kept sinking. Lots of surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became her daily reality. Still, she kept painting, perched on her bed, body locked tight in a corset, fingers gripping brushes like her life depended on it. Frida didn't come back to Mexico to rest. She came back to reclaim her power through art, politics, and fearlessly embracing herself. As the 1940s rolled on, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg kept getting infected. She endured over 30 surgeries in her life, many excruciating. Sometimes she was bedridden for months, in full body casts or stuck in bone-stretching contraptions. But she still painted. Each canvas was both an escape and an act of rebellion. Her work got darker and more defiant. She painted with clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphors. In the broken column, she split herself down the middle, body nailed in place, spine cracked, replaced by a shattered column, but her face stayed cold, eyes unflinching. For Frida, pain wasn't just a subject anymore. It was a companion, a rival, her muse. Her political voice grew as well. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, protested, wrote fiery letters, and condemned imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer let her walk, she showed up at protests in a wheelchair, holding banners high and shouting slogans loud. In 1953, Frida had her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art, but she was too weak. Doctors said she couldn't attend, so she did what only Frida could do. She arrived by ambulance, but carried in on a stretcher and placed right in the middle of the gallery, on her hospital bed, dressed in stunning traditional clothes, surrounded by her own work. She welcomed guests with tequila, laughter, and a fire still burning in her eyes. Her last paintings were both childlike and heartbreakingly raw. In a world where Marxism promised healing, she painted herself wearing a steel corset supported by wounded hands, shedding symbols of oppression. Her final known piece was a still life of watermelon slices. One slice was inscribed with "Viva la vida," long live life, even facing death. She stayed defiant, joyful, and political. Frida's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were revolutionary acts, painted with pain, but always marked by life. On July 13th, 1954, at 47 years old, Frida Kahlo died in the very place she was born, La Casa Azul in Coyoacan. Official cause pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered about something deeper. Sure, she was sick, but also worn down by pain, surgeries, and a long war with her own body. Just days before, she'd attended a political protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she still insisted on going, fist raised high. Revolution was still the last beat of her heart. Her final diary entry was short but sharp. I hope the departure is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural venue. Her body was draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even though his betrayals nearly broke her. In the years after her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name spread quietly among artists. Her works were hard to pigeonhole, too. Politics was surreal for surrealists, and way too surreal for the traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance started to spread. In the 70s and 80s, when scholars and feminists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's voice got louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She became a symbol of pain turned into beauty, feminism born from rebellion, and unapologetic Mexican pride. She stood for quirkiness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, her eyebrows, her gaze, and those flowers in her hair became icons. Her house turned into a museum. Her diaries became sacred texts, and her paintings now hang in the world's biggest museums. Frida Kahlo spent most of her life in Diego Rivera's shadow, but when she died, she stepped into the spotlight. She didn't just leave paintings behind. She left a mirror and dared all of us to look not with pity, not with fear, but with fire in our eyes. Today, Frida's face is everywhere on t-shirts, murals, dolls, memes, posters, and icons. That signature thick brow, flowered hair, and fierce stare, instantly recognizable. But the real power of her legacy isn't just that everyone knows her face. It's that they see the truth behind it. Frida never tried to be perfect. She didn't fit any mold. She wasn't traditional, and she didn't care to be. In a world obsessed with perfection, she gave us raw honesty, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, full of contradictions. She celebrated what made her different: disability, quirkiness, political and cultural views that turned into art crossing borders and decades. She became more than an artist, a global icon of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For the LGBTQ+ community, she's the fearless bisexual icon, living openly and without regrets in a world demanding silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't need permission. For disabled artists, proof that pain can fuel the brush instead of stop it. And for Mexico, she's a reborn daughter, fierce and folktale rich, forever part of the nation's soul. Her paintings, once called too weird or too private, are now some of the most revered in the world. Works like the double self-portrait with the thorn necklace and hummingbird, plus the broken column, aren't just seen. Anyone who's ever suffered and needed to transform that pain into something sacred feels it deeply. She lived in the suburbs and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradictions, a communist wearing gold, a betrayed woman who who loved again, a shattered body with an immortal soul. And through it all, she painted not just with colors, but with conviction. Contradictions: a communist who wore gold, a betrayed woman who loved again, a broken body with an immortal soul. And through it all, she painted not just with colors, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never wanted to be an icon. She just told the truth about herself, and in doing so, she spoke the truth for millions who'd never seen themselves reflected in art. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance. We see Frida not fading away, but living on forever. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance. We see Frida not fading away, but living on forever.